Hi there, Castroville. This is Zach Lewis with SimpleCity.Design, here to walk you through the code. I'll be giving you a basic chapter outline, how each function, and generally how to engage with this document. This has been a year-long process now, gathering community input, development of a comprehensive and downtown master plan, which can also be found on the website. All three of these were done in conjunction to ensure that there was alignment and policy direction and to gather the community at once, rather than coming back to the drawing board for each of these individual documents. We want to celebrate the tough conversations and deliberate action the community members, staff, policymakers have taken to ensure that this UDO is the best representation of Castroville's goals, aims, and ensure these aims can be as best carried out through clear process. The way we will do this is by reviewing the video outline, showing the basic chapter by chapter flow, then introducing those UDO chapters, going into more detail of how they function, how to navigate through them, including some of the critical components, and then give you an overview of the flow and design intent. There will be a number of repetitions of information in different formats, designs, so anybody engaging with the document can receive it in a manner that is most conducive for them. Below will be the full Unified Development Ordinance. Please see the document itself for more detailed analysis. So here's a chapter by chapter outline. Chapter 1 deals with, as it says, intent and provision. This is where we place out intent statements. This is where place general provisions for state law and basic code like defining language. Chapter 2, development process, is where all of your development processes will be housed. There are a number of ways to engage with them, which we'll show in the following slides. Then through chapter 3 through 5, these are separated according to scales of development in a city and differentiation between public and private zones. With chapter 3 having neighborhood additions and subdivisions, these are the farthest out of scale that a city would partake in. Chapter 4 is general place type zoning district for the city of Castroville. These deal with place type allocations of a lot and the public standards for the city. Chapter 5 is all of the private development standards, which dictates things like buildings, setback, frontage, and building types, lighting types, just to name a few. Really, anything that impacts the private lot is dictated in Chapter 5, with the second and last two being historic preservation. Okay, so the general provisions in Chapter 1 are the legal language, authority, and applicability. The point of these is to meet minimum standards that comply with state law. The second will be the purpose and intent statements. These are the guided principles for codes and how it's constructed and the regulations with it. These are pulled from conversations that we've had over the years with Castroville Citizen. Then it's rules of construction and transitional provisions, which are the provisions that explain how the document will transition from the CZO into the UDO. The majority of these are regulatory language to set up the foundation for the codes to match with state law, but we can go over the purpose and intent statements as they apply to the UDO. Here are the purpose statements. These are gathered from conversations in a year-long community engagement process and linked together with some of the goals aligned in the comprehensive plan. Community character, it's maintaining Castroville's unique rural and urban character in a small town atmosphere that has been a consistent point from Castroville citizens and policymakers alike. Part of that is kept by interconnectivity, which is the interconnectivity of the small block grid. There are parts of Castroville that do not have this, and particularly in new developments, but this will create a right to build this going forward. Stormwater management and infrastructure. It is one of the most critical components of Castroville's future success and livelihood, as the majority of the city is flood prone. Diverse housing and economic resilience go hand in hand. Diverse housing allows for economic resilience of the town, and economic resilience allows for diverse housing types. We delineate the intent statements at 3 different scales, as each scale requires different intents to match the needs for that specific scale. It is similar in the way that we break up our chapters based off of scale and public or private domain. The intent statements of the city are intended to preserve both the historic character of the city and continue that historic form from the way the city expands. That is primarily seen in the city growing in a logical progression, designing with additions to the existing fabric, not jumping 20 miles out of the way and throwing utility lines. This also gives geographic boundaries that make sense for the place. The intention here is for Castroville to be a series of neighborhoods that are linked together rather than subdivisions, which are separated and dispersed from each other. This will help sustain physical responsibility for the city and, as said in number 5, maintain the balance between the creation of jobs and housing units for residences and avoid it from becoming just a bedroom community. For the neighborhood scale, this is about extending the formation of neighborhoods that encompasses all uses of life and not just a singular use of residency or commercial neighborhood like downtown Castroville contains civic, institutional, commercial uses, school sites, parks, open spaces, and a variety of intensity and buildings, but organized in a manner that maintains a small town character and provides options for different styles of living. This is emulated through the intent statements here and throughout the document. The block, street, lot, and building intent statements are functional elements of the neighborhood intent, saying that Castroville is comprised of a network of streets and small walkable blocks designed in human scale. They provide areas, landscaping, and street trees, these private lots being used to accommodate them in the most efficient use of public infrastructure and so forth. The transition table is an illustration to describe how we translated zoning from the CZO to the UDO. This is not a direct translation, as the existing zoning does not allow for the type of development Castroville wants, but the general location and intent of these zoning districts is translated into the UDO. We look at elements from the DNA analysis and general analysis from the city and then emulate them into place site districts seen on the right for the historical district. There is a blue line going to P2, P25, P3, P4, and P5. This is indicating that the historic preservation district is being continued as a zoning overlay, and the characteristics within the historical district, both within the CG and AE, are then emulated into place types themselves. Chapter 2 is all of the possible development processes for any development in the city of Castroville. We place these into one easy-to-understand source in order to remove inconsistencies and provide clear process for anybody interested. The steps for development will depend upon the level of intensity that the development is. We ensure that the process remains largely unchanged, but this is the first time that all of these development processes have been consolidated into one clear place. Here is a graphical walkthrough of how the general process for development would occur. This makes it easy for applicants, staff, and the public to clearly understand what is involved in the process. As you can see, the first step for any development incoming in Castroville is to first determine whether or not it is in the historic overlay, which then it falls under all of the existing design parameters that are set forth in that overlay. As you can see, the larger neighborhood, the more intense of a process involved. This ensures that these larger projects do not overwhelm the city, but rather become a part of it. Here's an example of one of the development processes. Each have a very graphical, illustrative design to make it clear to read and understand. The majority of these chapters is all of the processes formatted in this way. They are then touched on again in this graph to illustrate all the parts of the involvement parties for each application process. This is Chapter 3, Neighborhoods, Additions, Subdivisions. In terms of development intensity, this is the furthest out that a potential development could be. As such, making sure that these are integrated into Castroville is critical. Here, the purpose, explanation of individual development patterns, the functioning of neighborhood plans, and details around planning are explored. So, development patterns. Neighborhoods can be laid out in a number of ways to create real neighborhood feel where all services are met and a diversity of lifestyles are available. There are three, which are outlined throughout the UDO and comprehensive plan, being traditional neighborhood development, cluster development, and village center development. Traditional neighborhood development is common to what is seen in Castroville today, a small block grid with streets developments flowing from a natural intensity of the place. Cluster land development is used to preserve green space by clustering developments together in an organized manner. The village center is similar to a cluster development, except it has a little bit higher drop-off between village center and a natural scene. Cluster and village are both techniques to preserve natural land for agriculture, recreation, and ecosystem continuity. Here's a sample of all of the development patterns in a lace together. A particular development can choose just one of the combinations or the two to be depending on the individual development and engagement with staff. In the comprehensive plan, locations of these development styles are outlined in each area type. Area of stability, area of change, downtown, and area of change are going to see traditional neighborhood development. Areas of conservation, cluster and village developments are encouraged to allow flexibility for neighborhoods that might feel too far to have a continuous line with Castroville, but could still retain a full neighborhood feel. If you're more curious about development patterns, where they go, and how they fit into the process, primarily pertaining to the ETJ, please see the comprehensive plan where there's more written on it. The code here takes the intention from the comprehensive plan of these development patterns and puts them into action through process. So, for any development larger than 2.5 acres, a neighborhood plan is required. This plan is submitted to the city where the place type designations are assigned based off of the surrounding land use, compatibility with that comprehensive plan, and lays out a basic street network. What this does is outlines the development process in full so policymakers, staff, and the community can clearly understand how it fits with the larger Castroville fabric. The reason we chose 2.5 acres is because it is the size of a Castroville block, and so any discussion of what to do with property around that size should be more involved and comprehensive. Going back to development patterns, here is a distribution of each place type for each development pattern. We keep these within ranges so that the conversation can be productive between the city and the developer in order to match both the intent of the city and realities of the current development climate. Through each of these development patterns, the creation of clear identifiable centers with logical progressions of intensity, similar to what is seen in Castroville, outward are encouraged and enforced through these place types. Chapter 4 is the place type designation. This is the public realm of the development dealing with its land use, street subject icons, and how the public engages with the private realm. There is a bit of vocab change here from zoning to place types. Zoning was created to separate uses and exclude communities from the city. Place types is concerned with building full places for communities where all services are met. It critically focuses more on the building form and how each building fits in a specific intensity for each place type zone. These are the place types for Castroville, starting with the least intense of P1, nature, and progressing up to the most intense version of P5, urban center. P1, as it reads, is intended for nature, meaning that human dwelling outside of recreational uses that are non-permanent is not permitted without special request. These were determined primarily based off of floodplains and topographical limitations. P2 rule is large agricultural land used for agricultural production or larger homesteads outside of central Castroville. P25 are the historic residential large lots that are characteristics of the Castroville area. These will maintain the large lots as well as a building form seen in the historic structures. P3 neighborhoods is a general neighborhood type allowing for a larger diversity of housing types that is seen in the historic residential, but serving a neighborhood context and not allowing for commercial development. P3M is a manufactured house. These are a translation from the existing manufacturing house development that are seen throughout Castroville's existing zoning. P4 is where the residential neighborhood and commercial district intersect. This is where the largest diversity of housing types for commercial and residential purposes exists, with the intention of allowing a more commercial feel, similar to what is seen in current downtown Castroville. P5 Urban Center is the most urbane development in Castroville, with buildings going directly up to the sidewalk, creating a strong pedestrian walkway and more commercially associated uses for these buildings. Employment centers is the place type for uses and situations that don't cleanly fit into any of the P1 through P5 designations. Under existing zoning, these exist as industrial use, and the same uses for each of those have been agreed upon before and will be continued. Employment center operates as a negotiating tool the city and staff to determine how larger structure or employment centers would form in Castroville. Civic space is, as it implies, all of the civic buildings throughout Castroville, including schools, churches, city property, and property currently owned by nonprofits. As you can see in the place type map, the place types have a natural progression from least intense to most intense in commercial corridors. You'll see that P5 sits primarily on Highway 90. The intention behind this is for real commercial districts along 90 rather than an auto-dependent form to take place as each development changes over. This creates both a new district for the city, but also a buffer for the rest of the community. If you have any questions about your property or are concerned about your place type of your property, you are available to submit a zoning request form to be deliberated as part of the processing of the project. The map was a culmination of taking the translation table and analysis of the existing built-in environment, input from the community through our year-long engagement process, and our own professional opinions. For the remainder of Chapter 4, you will see a series of charts such as this one. These contain almost 90% of what is encompassed in the development ordinance. We want to make it as easy as possible for anybody coming into this document to clearly understand the rules, the regulations, and how they interact with each other. The chart is then translated into individual standards for each place type, as you can see here. All of the ways the building types function is outlined here by dictating specifics of lot dimensions, placements of the building through the build line, and the general lot coverage to give a basic shape of the form of these buildings in each place type. It is through the building type, frontage types, street types, parking locations, and for the remainder of Chapter 4, you will see a series of charts such as this one. These contain almost 90% of what encompasses in the development ordinance. We want to make it as easy as possible for anybody coming to this document to clearly understand the rules, the regulations, and how they interact with each other. The chart is then translated into individual standards for each place, as you can see here. All of the place types functions is outlined here by dictating specifics of lot dimensions, placement of the building through building line, and general lot coverage to give a basic shape and form of these buildings in each place type. It is through the building types, frontage types, street types, parking locations, and building dispositions that options which fit within the context of the existing environment are available in this code. The reasons for having this diversity of information transmission is because people read and learn in different ways and also are engaging with the document for different reasons. So then different forms of finding that information is helpful. These are then spoken more in detail in Chapter 5, as this chapter is concerned with private development standards. This includes the lot structure, building types, building placement, private frontage types, lighting, and signage, amongst some other things. Here is a visualization of the elements of a lot and how they are administered in place type zoning. We break the lot up into 3 layers, the first being the space in front of the house, the second being a fixed layer. It is a 20-foot from a front facade that it's where the parking starts. The third layer is the space behind the primary structure. It's where accessory structures would fit. The build to line has ranges depending on the type, just as many Castroville buildings have broad ranges of where buildings can be placed on a lot. How the private domain interacts with that public is one of the critical components of how neighborhoods look and feel. This is why specific attention is paid through private frontage types. Here we allow a number of options on your place type. The more urbane frontages types allow for ones which create an awning that allows shade or is closer to the public zone to allow for businesses to better engage and attract the public for these higher zone types. But whereas more residential forms like porches, common yards, and stoops are seen in the lesser intense place types. And here's a graphical representation of some of the building types that are listed in the tables throughout the document. These are definitions which help find the building and a general graphical representation of what they could look like. Furthermore, the lighting standards and sign standards are also listed based off of their place type. Just as different building types fit in the different place types and contexts, the same applies for different lighting and sign standards. Just as the rest of the document, the sign standards have a similar graphical explanation and walkthrough of each of these types. Historic preservation chapter is the criteria for design standards, maintenance standards, and certificate of appropriateness. These are continuation of the preservation work and regulations that currently exist. The Appendix A is the design guidelines for the historic preservation, and the preservation overlay is the jurisdiction for these design guidelines. These design guidelines are listed as a exact copy of what was currently worked through the community in Castroville, and we're excited to continue these in the UDO. Similarly, with the design guidelines, the historic preservation overlay is a continuation of what was in the previous CZO, and they now exist as a code overlay. And thank you so much for watching and spending time to learn about how your UDO impacts and affects your community success and future. Here is a rough schedule of the project's rollout. November 7th, the code was submitted to the public, and a 6-week online review is available up until December 20th. In that time, the public is welcome to engage, look with, and comment on the document itself. December 10th and 11th will be a 2-part engagement event. The first day will be a community code overview. This is where you can see your property, look it up on the zoning map, see if there's anything you'd like to change on your property or questions you might have. The policymaker overview will be a meeting with planning and zoning and the PAC. In this meeting, we will hear these policymakers' questions on the code and get direction from them. January 8th is a conventional planning and zoning meeting where we will present the comprehensive plan, downtown plan, and UDO to the P&Z for review. Here is also where the community comments that we will have consolidated will be given first recommendation from the Planning and Zoning Commission to Council's first reading. To be clear, this is the intended schedule as of now. If issues arise and more time is decided to be needed, the schedule will adjust accordingly. Thank you so much for listening and spending the time. We look forward to hearing y'all's comments and eventually delivering the best version of the UDO for the Castroville community.